Good afternoon and welcome to the Sustainable Materials Management webinar series, a joint effort between the National Recycling Coalition and the Pennsylvania Recycling Market Center. My name is Wayne Bowen and I'm the Program Manager for the Market Center and will serve as your moderator today. We would like to extend a special thanks to Bob Hollis of the Mobius Network for providing the webinar management software for this series, and Lisa Ruggiero of the National Recycling Coalition for providing technical support. Today's webinar focus is on carbon credit markets. Our presenter today is Dr. Scott Subler, who will be introduced in a moment. Following the presentation, we will conduct a question and answer session. If you have a question or comment, please use the GoToWebinar dialog box located in the control panel on your screen. You may also use the dialog box to request assistance if you are experiencing technical difficulties during the webinar. Please note that an edited version of this webinar will be made available for viewing via YouTube links on the National Recycling Coalition and Pennsylvania Recycling Market Center websites. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter. Scott Subler is the president and co-founder of Environmental Credit Corporation, a leading U.S. offset project developer located in State College, Pennsylvania. Dr. Subler also founded and operated the Pacific Garden Company, which produced and marketed vermicompost and organic soil fertility products. Before his business ventures, he was a research scientist and professor at The Ohio State University, where he managed several federally funded research grant programs concerned with agricultural nitrogen cycling and carbon management. Dr. Subler chaired the Offset Committee of the Chicago Climate Exchange from 2007 to 2011 and has served on the board of directors of the U.S. Composting Council, as well as several other advisory boards. Dr. Subler received his doctorate in ecosystem ecology from Penn State University. Okay, Scott, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Wayne. Also, thanks to Bob Bylone and the Pennsylvania Recycling Market Center for the opportunity today. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I can't see any faces, so I'll just assume you're all smiling and we'll be laughing at my jokes. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so very quickly, what I'm going to be talking about, in order to discuss carbon credit markets for recycling activities, it's hard because there's a lot of terms that are used in various different ways. So I'm going to start by just kind of going through how, in my industry, we use the term carbon credits and some of the specific meanings that get attached to that. And actually, I'll go from general to specific on that. Then we'll get into a little bit of the history of carbon markets, carbon credit markets, and where we are right now and how that might impact recycling activities. And so that first half may, for some people, be a little bit of a review. I'm not going to get into super detail. I'm going to skip across a number of things just to make sure that there's context in place. And then I'm going to talk about some specific activities, refrigerant recycling, organic residuals recycling, and then materials, or otherwise known as hard materials recycling, and how carbon credits or carbon offset credits apply to those activities. And then obviously there'll be a little bit of conclusion and discussion of where we are with policy. I think it's important to bring up at this point, Wayne gave me a nice introduction. We've been doing this for about, or working in this carbon credit space for about 11 years now, and it seems like we're always waiting for something to happen, or we're always waiting for something to restart. And so I guess the point there is that there are a lot of emerging opportunities, and it isn't only until recently that some of the policies have really started to gel, and we may be able to rely on some pathways or directions for the future. So there's ample opportunity simply by understanding what's happened in the past, what's going on now for people in various industries, whether they're going to be regulated under some kind of carbon regulation, or whether they're in the recycling business or the composting business, having industries and particularly policymakers aware of what we've done and what seems to work and what isn't working and what's applicable and what's not, I think is pretty important. So I'm glad I have the chance to talk to you today. The other thing I'll give you when I talk about applicability here on this slide, a tiny bit of a spoiler alert. and this is not news to most people, but for some materials recycling activities, there's not a whole lot of opportunity for carbon credits. So I'll spend some time talking about why that might be, and at the end, what other types of opportunities there might be other than what we call carbon credits today. Okay, just so you know, there's a lot of jargon here, and I'm going to try and do two things. I'm going to try and not throw too many acronyms at you, and if I do, Wayne, you can slap me in some electronic way. And I'm also going to try and explain some of how these terms are used, so you'll have if you don't already have a little bit better understanding, or at least cue into some of these terms a little bit better. So the acronyms, hopefully some of them will make sense to you at the end of the talk. Okay, the first thing is how people use the term carbon credits, because it can mean all sorts of things, and that from where I sit, it ends up being the first point of confusion that in a number of discussions we get into with people in various industries or with policymakers. So I've got sort of a funky slide here that goes from general in the upper left-hand corner to specific. Generally, we can call something a carbon credit when there's monetary value for an activity that reduces carbon emissions or that reduces the carbon intensity of producing a product. And so that's the most general sense. Usually the concept of quantification is tied to that you can actually count up the benefit, the emissions reduction benefits, and that's typically expressed as metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. As you get a little bit more specific, especially in my field, when we talk about carbon credits, we're typically talking about project-based emission reductions that are very often verified or monitored and reported according to some kind of methodology or protocol that's accepted by others, although that's not always the case. And then more specifically, when someone says carbon credits, or when I talk about carbon credits, what we usually mean is carbon offset credits. And that, we'll talk a little bit about what that is, but that's really kind of what I'm going to focus on today, because that's the market that exists. And then if you want to go all the way to the jargon, there are CRTs and DCUs and ROCs and EOCs and CCOs and CFIs and lots of other things that really don't make any sense. So I'm going to focus mostly today on the meaning of carbon offset credits when I say carbon credits. Okay, obviously, and by comparison, there are other types of greenhouse gas related credits that I suppose you could call carbon credits too in the most general sense. You're familiar with many of these, I'm sure, the renewable energy certificates, RECs, and green energy credits, from solar or wind. Renewable fuel credits through federal programs or state programs have names like RINs and LCF credits. Although those are monetary value tagged to greenhouse gas emission reductions, they have their own terms, and so we don't really typically call those carbon credits, although you certainly could if you wanted. Okay, getting into the markets. I think probably the most important thing to realize right now is there are really two very different markets, at least as broad categories, for carbon credits. And those split into voluntary markets and compliance markets. And so the voluntary markets, it can be individuals or companies or environmental advocates or states in some cases who aren't required by any law to reduce emissions but want to do that anyway. You can offset your airplane, the emissions from your airplane flight from San Francisco to let's say Baltimore, just by clicking on a button on almost every one of the travel sites. Those are within the voluntary market. They're simply, I don't want to say feel good, they're ways that people are making progress towards reducing their own organizational or personal emissions. The credits that are sold into that particular market carry qualities along with them that some people call charismatic credits. In other words, where the project was done, what type of project it is, when it was done, and any kind of really good PR story that you can tell about those projects is often very important in the value that you might get. So a large utility in Washington State might prefer to get credits from projects that are done in Washington State. On the other hand, hey Wayne, I think there's some background noise there. Just I'm picking it up from somewhere. Everyone was turned off. Anyway, the other part is the compliance market, and the compliance market is when there is actually a legal regulatory program in place. Typically, it'll be a cap and trade type policy, and carbon credits are a part of that. And in that case, it doesn't really matter where the project was done or what type it was. The credits are somewhat commoditized, so you'll pay the same price to use a carbon credit or an offset credit in place of purchasing an emissions allowance or permit. And you'll pay the market price, and the qualities of there's not a lot of charisma attached to those credits. The other point I'll bring up now, and I'll show again, is that the compliance market is, since it's forced on people, is typically where we've seen the greatest value and continue to see the greatest value. All right, just to quickly go over voluntary markets, and I think I said some of this. A long time ago, and it still occurs, there used to be, you could call them ad hoc credits, basically consultant reports written up about a particular project, and then, with a number on it, in many cases, of emissions reductions that project created. And a company or an organization would then purchase that as a way of rewarding or incentivizing that project activity. Sometimes they're verified independently, and sometimes they're not. And we used to have a term in the industry called Ben and Jerry's credits, because Ben and Jerry's, the ice cream company, a long time ago was involved in this kind of stuff. In Vermont, it was very much, a company wanted a consultant to write a report. It was all done based on the consultant's concept of how it ought to be put together. It's formalized since then, so that there are things called offset registries or offset programs, and the ones that are active, well, 3 of the 4 are still active in the U.S. American Carbon Registry, the Climate Action Reserve, Verified Carbon Standard. The Chicago Climate Exchange ended its second period back in 2010, so even though there's still a registry there with credits lurking, there's no real activity. Those have specific protocols or methodologies. They typically require, for each project type, they typically require independent or third-party verification. So there's a formality of the program and also a standardization of the program. Okay, switching to compliance market, which will be kind of scattered throughout this. The key point here is that there's a regulation that's kind of forcing people to do something. Typically, it's a cap and trade program, and then that cap and trade program will have an offsets component associated with it. And the little flags and pictures on the right go from the UN framework that arose from the Kyoto with the European trading system. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative has a compliance market in the northeastern United States, many of them. California obviously has a cap and trade program. That's a compliance program, and the EPA is currently working on revisions of their, I guess they call it their Clean Power Rule, that is likely to come out in final form sometime this year. All right, to back up a little bit, going back to June of 2009, this is the map of essentially the umbrella of a compliance program over the world, and you can see in red the country that didn't ratify or had no intention of ratifying. Now that's kind of changed. Australia and Canada have been in and out quite a bit. I think the effort applied by some other nations has reduced over time, and that, whether that's because the U.S. didn't involve itself or did, I don't know. But this is, there has been an attempt at having a fairly broad umbrella of regulation, or at least a program that has regulation combined with offsets throughout the world for, going on 10 years or so. This is where we are now, and this is a little bit different but this is actually regulatory schemes. That last slide, there was a split between obligated parties, which were the developing nations, and then which were the developed nations, and then the undeveloped nations, or developing nations they called it, didn't have the same kind of obligations to meet emissions caps that the developed countries did. In this case, you can see a lot of those, China wasn't included, India wasn't included, Brazil wasn't included under a cap, yet they're all starting to form their own carbon trading or carbon regulation schemes. And so this is just to give you an idea. This is not an isolated thing that's occurring in one state or two states or 9 northeastern states. And this is a little bit old, but it gives you an idea of, at the state level and province level, what's been considered over the past several years. The orange in the right is the RGGI states, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiatives. They have a cap and trade program that's been enforced for a number of years. And then California obviously has a cap and trade program, which seems to be working its way up the coast to British Columbia. And then there are a number of other initiatives that have kind of turned off and on in the past, but the coming EPA regulations may force the joining of these initiatives or new state initiatives of some sort. And this is the map of, I guess, what would you call it, the severity of regulation, or the magnitude of emission reductions that are expected for various states. And this is under the first draft of the proposed EPA rule, so I'm sure all of this is changing, and I'm not sure how it'll come out. But so every state very soon could be under some kind of compliance obligation, which puts an opportunity for an expanded compliance market for carbon offset credits or carbon credits. Okay, right now though, there are only a couple that are active. The Chicago Climate Exchange was voluntary. Nobody forced them to get together, but I've got pseudo-compliance in there because any company that joined the Chicago Climate Exchange essentially contracted into a legally binding obligation to reduce emissions and to come up with allowances and retire those for every ton of emissions they created. So it wasn't really compliance, but it had a somewhat of a forced market, if you want to put it that way. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative started, I think their first auction was in 2008. They haven't had a high price, not much has gone on there. They way undershot or overshot with their cap what they actually had in emissions. That's been tightened up in 2013. And they've had an offsets program, a carbon offsets program associated with that for some time, but there hasn't been a single project, so I'm basically showing a flat line for offset activity there, which leaves us with California. And it's not important to see the numbers here, although the red line there never gets below $10. That's for allowances, and there's always, or in this case, there's a bit of a spread of a couple dollars between the allowance price and what you might get for a carbon offset credit. But that price is stabilized, and it seems to be ratcheting up because there's essentially a floor price for allowances within the California program that forces that price line up over time. And it's the only one of those three charts that isn't riding near zero. So it's really the only compliance market in the game in the U.S. at this point. And I think that's going to change over the next several years, but that's where most of the activity, I would say both compliance and voluntary, well, not voluntary, the compliance activity is. Most of the activity right now in the U.S. is compliance and focused on California. Oh, all right, this is just review. I'm sure you understand how cap and trade works, but basically what this slide calls the traditional approach, or other people call the command and control approach, is to say you have to reduce your emissions by 30% by year X. And so every plant does it on their own, and they have that hard cap where they have to reduce their emissions. cap and trade is a little bit more flexible, and it focuses on the overall emission reductions rather than each individual plant's emissions reduction. And it allows trading of permits for emissions among different obligated parties, or in this case, boxes with smokestacks on them. It's a way of actually reaching the exact same goal with regard to emission reduction, but at a lower cost, because the lower cost activities can be focused on first rather than, regardless of cost. So, like I said, I'm sure you're familiar with cap and trade. Then you take that box and you throw it in the circle here, call that the capped sector or the regulated sector. Then you have a bunch of unregulated sectors of the economy that aren't affected by that cap. They're not obligated to do anything. It's essentially voluntary activity on that side. Not that they're unregulated, they're just unregulated with respect to this carbon policy. And if somebody says, well, let's reduce emissions in agriculture or with refrigerant recycling, because all of these categories have some significant emissions associated with them. It'd be nice to reduce them. They're hard to regulate largely because they're diffuse emissions. There's no smokestack to point at. But the way a cap and trade program with offsets works is that if emission reductions are made through projects in these unregulated sectors, those quantified, real, certified emission reductions can then be used in place of a permit or allowance or an allowance in the capped sector. So it offsets emissions from the capped sector. Therefore the name offsets. An important thing, obviously it's important because I put it in red there to remind myself, and this is a lot of people have a hard time getting this. Just because a project reduces emissions compared to something doesn't mean that it's entitled in any way to offset credits. It's not automatic. There's a policy, lane you have to drive. There's a lot of stuff that goes on in order to get certified to be eligible, and lots of projects that reduce emissions simply aren't eligible at all, just because of the way the policy has been developed. Okay. I'm going to switch over to, I'm going to switch over to offset projects now, and talk about common features of offset projects. And I know this is a bit theoretical. I'll get into a little bit more case study stuff in a few minutes. Okay, so offset projects have to be voluntarily conducted. They have to be outside. I mean, a lot of these things are sort of redundant, but they're different ways of saying the same thing. They have to be outside of that regulated sector. They can't be required by law. They're not something that's been practiced routinely for the past 20 years. And there's a feeling that there's some kind of barrier to those types of projects naturally, springing forth and getting greater penetration. Offset projects have to operate, they have to monitor, they have to report according to very specific quantification methodologies, or we just call them protocols. They have to be good players with regard to all the other laws that they work under. Most offset programs don't give you credits, even if you've earned them through emission reductions, if you're violating a number of other environmental or other regulations, which kind of makes sense. And then the emission reductions, in order to be used as offsets, must be additional. And I'll talk about that. That's a key term in here. It isn't really that confusing once you get your hands around it, but it gets thrown around an awful lot, and so I'll talk about it too. And then in extending this checklist one further, if we're talking about compliance offsets for the compliance market, those have to be from the very beginning an approved project type. It isn't sort of a walk in and get your haircut type of thing. Okay, so back to this term additionality, and just I think the easiest way to get it, if you don't already, is ask the question: are the emission reductions additional to what would have happened without the project? And that's, it seems fairly obvious that if they would have happened anyway, then why would you be getting credits or even claiming that you've made emission reductions? In the formalization of offset policy, there's usually a number of tests that people go through. The regulatory test, we talked about this, not required by law. The common practice test, not something that's already been commonly occurring or is already commonly occurring. And then there's some sort of financial test that basically says, look, if this technology is brand new, it's not required by law, it's not already occurring, but it's such a slam dunk that it's undoubtedly going to be disruptive and it's going to replace things. The question then comes, why do you need to give it a carbon credit incentive? It's going to happen anyway. It's not quite that cut and dry in the real world. Typically things that aren't common right now, there's an assumption that there must be some barrier or another, and being new is a barrier. So it's applied a little bit differently in different places, but be aware that it's there. And the problem with not being very careful about additionality, and most of the offset protocol development and discussion and consideration somewhere or another focuses around this additionality issue. Otherwise, you're going to be giving credits to people to offset their real emissions. And if they're not additional credits, then you're going to be either double counting in some areas, or you're going to be overstating the overall net emission reductions that you have under your capped program. And so you might think you're meeting your overall program goals, but you may be in physical reality with regard to emissions of greenhouse gases or reductions of greenhouse gases not getting there at all. So people are very careful with the additionality of projects. Okay, calculating project emissions or project emission reductions is very simple. And again, this is probably review for many of you, but it always requires two things. You're always comparing what a project does relative to some baseline activity. Even though that baseline is purely hypothetical, and the term that gets used a lot, I guess because people think it sounds better, is counterfactual, which doesn't really sound better to me. But you're always comparing what happens in a project to what would have happened had that project not occurred. And in both cases, you have to add up all of the direct greenhouse gas emissions that took place. You have to look at fossil fuel emissions, and you have to figure out what the indirect emissions from using grid electricity might have been. And that gets fairly complicated, but the balance sheet on both sides looks pretty much the same. It's just the numbers are going to be different, and that's how you determine what the overall emission reductions are from the project. Okay, getting more into some of a little bit more detail, but not much. An offset project cycle has a lot of elements to it that if you're just going to go ahead and do it, you wouldn't be doing. The gray boxes show what you would do if you started a project and didn't care about carbon credits. If you want to get carbon offset credits, all the other things are necessary, except for maybe protocol development. Like I said, with the compliance market, protocols are typically already in place, so you don't have to go through that step. But you have to formally apply and list your project with an offset registry or an offset program, State of California, Climate Action Reserve, one of those. You have to then monitor the project. You have to write that stuff up in a report. That has to be verified by a third-party verification body that's typically accredited by the offset registry or the offset program. Then the registry will review it, and if there's another program involved, and this is the way it is with California, it's kind of a two-step, then the program will review it. Then finally those credits get registered or issued, and at some point shortly after that, hopefully you're able to make the sale on them. Looking at it in a slightly more linear way, and I'm going to bring up the cost issue here. You can see that in many protocols there's an annual reporting cycle. So you've listed your project in the registry. The project starts on January 1st. You run it for a year, and during that time you have to monitor according to the protocol. After that year, there's some time it takes because it's not going to be done in one day. You've got to spend a couple months doing the report preparation. In many cases, these are very much like detailed bureaucratic environmental compliance reports. Following that, you give the reports to the verifier. They also typically have to make a site visit and poke around and do an audit. That can take a few months before the verifier is done writing their verification report, which they hand to the registry. The registry, like I said, will do their review, and that takes some time. They, depending on the system, they'll issue their credits, the registry credits. But if you're going, let's say, through California, those aren't the final credits. You then have to go through a program review where they go back to the verifier and to the reports. They look at it all again. Eventually, they make up their minds and issue credits within that program. And then for some reason, those credits aren't, in some cases, not released immediately. So you have to wait a little bit longer. And then finally, once you get those credits released, you can go to market, and there are a number of a number of exchanges where that's relatively easy to do, and make the sale. And so the point here is there's an awful lot of cost involved for a fairly long time period before the dollars come back, and that can be punishing for small projects in particular. I might add that the term for a lot of these costs, not the people time and effort, but the typical things associated with verification, registry fees, program fees, those are called transaction costs, and it's always a part of policy to try and figure out how to reduce those. I don't think that was a huge priority in California, but hopefully, as things go along, that will get better in those transactions. I mean, a verification fee, depending on project size, is typically in the tens of thousands of dollars. And there's a lot of other fees to get your credits in and get credits out. So, anyway, I think you get a sense these are not just you go up to the booth and someone hands you, $50. It's a long and tedious process that has nice rewards at the end, but some staying power is required. All right, I'm going to run through, since we're still on compliance projects, I'm going to run through the types of projects, the offset projects that are eligible in the state of California, just so you can see the bigger picture, and then I'll hop into a couple of different recycling types of projects. Okay, there are forestry projects, reforestation, planting new trees, doing a better job of forestry management, all focused and setting aside, or a conservation set aside for forests to be held for 100 years so it doesn't get chopped down. All of these things either increase the sequestration of carbon in forest biomass, or they reduce the degradation of that biomass through disease, fire, lumbering, that kind of thing. And then there's also an urban forest project protocol, which, I don't know what to say. Tree planting in cities, basically, I think the picture says pretty much everything. Okay, the other one, or another one, is livestock projects, and more specifically the capture and destruction of methane that's produced from cow manure, well, any livestock manure, but typically cow or dairy manure that's in the baseline scenario would have been handled in a large anaerobic lagoon or pit. And instead, you can put a pool cover, something like this on top to capture all of that gas. That can go to a flare, genset to create electricity, or it could be cleaned up for CNG for a truck fleet or something like that. Those are all real examples. And in that case, the methane, which is 21 to 23 times more potent in its global warming potential compared to carbon dioxide, is essentially combusted and reduced back or oxidized back to CO2. That project, even in the voluntary market years past, has been fairly successful. I wouldn't say it was in the, well, certainly not the thousands, maybe not the many hundreds, but there've been quite a few of these types of projects. I can't find a good slide for methane that seeps slowly from the walls of old mine beds, so I've found a more interesting slide. There's a protocol with California for essentially capturing and then either combusting or, I guess, analytically converting the methane that comes out of old coal mines and trona mines, which I had no idea what was, but apparently sodium carbonate is mined just like coal is. And then the final one, and it wasn't a very long list, is for the destruction of ozone-depleting substances, typically refrigerants or foam gases that are found in white goods and commercial HVAC equipment and a few other places. Okay, so here's the whole list. I just went through it. There are only 5 protocols. There's not a whole lot of recycling that you've seen on that. So that means the recycling projects, a couple of them I'll be talking about, are still kind of stuck in the voluntary market, where the prices seem to be going down as the California compliance market prices seem to be going up. So I think there are things that can be done, but in our experience or expectation is it takes a very long time for California to pass or to do the evaluation and pass a new protocol. So this is what we have right now. All right, so let's go to one that they do have, and that's refrigerant recycling. And this is actually a really important one. It's one that we've been involved with for many years and have been pretty excited about because the EPA actually started with the CCX to develop the protocol that's being used right now, at least the base for it. Ozone depleting substances sit around, they're phased out under the Montreal Protocol, they're not being produced anywhere, but you can still use them in old equipment that take that kind of gas. So they're recycled to some extent, and they're stockpiled to probably a greater extent. And, you know, not surprisingly, there's probably a lot of venting that goes on, which is illegal, but a lot easier than, you know, paying to take the truck to the tip station to drop the refrigerator off and then pay a fee. So unfortunately, EPA recognized this years ago and said if we don't do something about it now, because, I mean, if you look on the right-hand side, the global warming potential of these gases relative to CO2 are astounding. 10, 11,000, 14,000 times as potent in the atmosphere as CO2 is. So EPA said this is sort of an emergency thing because this stuff in 10 years is going to be pretty much leaked out. The Montreal Protocol didn't really require destruction. It just said you couldn't vent it and you couldn't make it anymore. So I guess the point I'm going to make, and I'll show it very quickly, is that the carbon offset markets, carbon credits for ozone depleting substances destruction, has absolutely transformed the refrigerant recycling industry in the U.S. over the past 5 to 7 years. It's a really good example of how well-placed emission reduction incentives or carbon credit incentives can change the way a lot of players do things to really have a huge hit on atmospheric greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so this is a very simplistic attempt at showing some of the refrigerant recovery pathways from the various sources in green on the left through a series of middle players, but there tend to be some top-level predator recycling firms that often end up with the bulk of the gases that come out of old refrigerators or air conditioners and HVAC equipment, that kind of thing. And you can see that, you know, white goods go to the tipping facility, and municipalities have to figure out what to do with them. Retail exchange programs have really benefited. Largely, a lot of this is subsidized by, or there are examples where this has been really well subsidized by large utilities that have a compliance obligation in California that see that they essentially are paying for the carbon credits that come from burning the ozone depleting substances that come out of these old white goods, but it's managed through, you know, like a Lowe's or another large retail outlet where they have these retail exchange programs that have been very effective in getting those old pieces of equipment out of people's garages and torn apart at the recycling facilities where the gas is intended to go to destruction in, you know, Arkansas or only a few other places in the country where you can do this. ECC, my company, has been pretty heavily involved in this for many years now. We focus, you know, we've partnered with some of the top level recyclers, and this is an example. I hope you can see it. There's a white ISO tank there with 30,000 pounds, I guess, of refrigerants with pretty high global warming potential. So destroying and then we have to take that, or we've been taking those down to Arkansas to a RCRA destruction facility where they can burn it up, and it's all EPA regulated, and there's tons of paperwork associated with it. But a tank like that, you know, there could be I want to get, I got to be careful with pricing, but let's say there's probably $1 million of carbon credits that can come out of something like that. I mean, there's costs for the facility, there are transaction costs, there's a lot of other costs, but that is a lot of greenhouse gas emissions being destroyed and prevented from entering the atmosphere. And just to drive that point home, within California, that's only been doing these offset programs for a few years now, there have been 99 projects that have gone through with about 8 million RBOCs, which is, ARB is the Air Resources Board of California, which is the regulator for their cap and trade program. RBOCs is ARB offset credits. That's pretty close to half of all of the offset credits that have been issued by the Air Resources Board in California over the past, well, since they started, which was 2 or 3 years ago. So it's a pretty important program. The other half, more or less, is from the forestry-related projects. Okay, well, the other thing we've done, because there's a lot of steps in that other pathway, is that ECC, my company, has been working directly with municipalities in Pennsylvania and some private organizations as well to work through their current white goods, sort of gas recovery programs, and hopefully reducing costs related to those programs, and actually providing some carbon credit incentive back, or if not carbon credit incentive back, a recycling value, because the carbon credit stuff within the ODS recycling markets has actually brought the prices of some of the unregulated gases up as well, which is good if you're doing the recovery and not good if you're paying for the gas. Okay, there's some of the benefits of the program, and again, we've got a few counties in Pennsylvania where there's no longer a disposal cost for the refrigerants. We provide the tanks. You don't have to worry about tanks. There's no, they don't have to be trucked around anywhere by employees. The training and the sort of routine process that we get people to do avoids having to pay, HVAC contractors or others coming in to have a per appliance fee to recover refrigerants. And then it basically allows for control with a better cost structure, either reduced disposal cost or no disposal cost at all, or a little bit of positive. So it's a nice program. It's not a huge amount of money, but I think by allowing municipalities to not have to charge people to bring refrigerators, if they do, it'll prevent a few more refrigerators from being tipped over into the ravine, which is not good. Okay, I can do this in another 5 minutes, Wayne. Okay, so I'll switch over to organic residuals recycling, and this. Did you have a comment, Wayne?
No, we're okay.
Okay, well, I'm moving right on through. Okay, so we're starting a new project type, and this is either composting or anaerobic digestion of, I'm not supposed to say food waste anymore, food residuals. And I think probably most of you understand this because landfill gas capture had been a big offset project type in the voluntary market for some time, and this is somewhat similar. You avoid methane emissions from landfills by diverting the stuff that creates those emissions, and in this case we're talking about yard and food waste. And even though I've got the baseline scenario and the project scenario there showing composting, anaerobic digestion is obviously anaerobic, but the gas is all captured and destroyed and turned into CO2 when it enters the atmosphere, so it creates a significant emission reduction as well. So I'm going to talk about the protocol. The Chicago Climate Exchange had a protocol many years back that I think we got one project on the Nantucket through. The Climate Action Reserve, or CAR, has a composting protocol. They also have an anaerobic digestion protocol. So I'm going to focus on composting, but there are a lot of similarities between the two. The key things here are that only food waste is eligible. Composting of yard and wood waste has been essentially either mandated by law or forced in some other way, or so common at this point that in most cases that's not considered an additional activity. So the focus is on commercial source-separated organics, on residential organics, which can include food residuals mixed in with yard waste. There are a number of collection programs that are doing that right now. And even straight old municipal solid waste, where there's a factor for how much food waste might actually be in that, although practically nobody composts straight municipal solid waste or anaerobically digests it, although I suppose there's an opportunity there. There's some pains with this protocol. For some reason, grocery store wastes are treated with great, I'd say additional documentation, actually kind of suspicion, and it's difficult. Food processing waste is not eligible under the composting protocol, although under the anaerobic digestion protocol, some waste streams may be, so there's some strange incompatibilities. And all of these projects assume that in the baseline scenario, there is some level of landfill gas collection occurring. So it's not just how much methane would have come out in a landfill without gas collection systems. It assumes the baseline is a landfill that had a gas, or let's say implements gas collection according to EPA requirements for large landfills. Okay, the other thing about this, just as the sort of the general statement I made, where landfill diversion of organics is mandated, these protocols aren't eligible because it's required by law. There are some slight accommodations in the Climate Action Reserve protocols where, if local community it wants to put in a mandate, and that's done in conjunction, which is not really well defined, but I think we know what it means, with a composting program, because otherwise their entire composting pilot might fail. There is a possibility that you can still get credits for a certain period, and I won't go into detail there, but it's actually a very nice feature where clearly they thought through the policy and said that in this case, even though it might be required by a local law, that's essentially the community making a project happen along with the necessary composting infrastructure. I'm not going to go into detail. Like every offset project, you have to weigh a lot of things. One thing I will say, and you have to write reports and you have to monitor a bunch of things, I would say that this composting protocol, and we've been on a number of composting facilities, I'll show you in a minute, and we've registered most of the composting project credits through the the Climate Action Reserve program. In almost every case, the level of effort required to do this protocol stuff far exceeds any regulatory requirement or reporting requirement that those facilities would have had or had. It's fairly heavy, detailed environmental compliance work. There's a smattering of bureaucracy throughout that creates additional costs. And just, I don't know, there may be some technically minded people out there just to show you that there's math in these things. It's not just about simple statements. This is one portion of the calculation that you need in order to come up with the baseline methane emissions and the project methane emissions. So that's kind of a throwaway slide. Okay, so far, I don't know if this is good or bad. It doesn't seem like a lot of projects. There are 1, 2, 3, 4 composting projects in all of the U.S. that have registered credits through the Climate Action Reserve, and there's one anaerobic digestion project. Altogether, 350,000 tons, and a couple of those ISO containers that I showed you on the maybe 3 of those ISO containers from the previous slide would be about 300,000 tons. So I think there are a number of difficulties with this, but it's also a start, and I suppose if you've got to starting with the largest potential emission reduction, which are the largest facilities in the country, is a good place to start. Okay, now, and I kind of telegraphed this earlier, metal, paper, plastic, and glass, hard materials recycling, and this is probably not news to anybody. Those types of activities are just not likely to be applicable for the sort of traditional offset credits in the U.S. The emission reductions that come from recycling are typically indirect. They're likely to be capped or regulated somewhere else in in the regulated sector. Recycling has been both mandated and common practice in most states for quite some time. And so for those reasons, the traditional carbon offset program or approach is probably not going to be a path that we would go down. I think there are other opportunities. But just as a consolation prize, if you are in a developing nation, the Clean Development Mechanism, which is part of the UN framework, does have a carbon credit protocol or methodology for doing recovering and recycling of materials from solid waste. This shows the baseline and project scenarios for using recycled plastics as a raw material for plastic products, as opposed to using virgin petroleum products. And I think we all understand why there's a benefit there, and this just kind of maps it out. So yes, there are carbon credit protocols for plastics recycling. It's just they're not relevant in the United States. Okay, so concluding slides. Not really conclusion. There are more things to think about as you think about policy, and now, like I said at the beginning, the stuff hasn't fully gelled yet. So there's a good opportunity to be involved in, both at the industry level, at the community level, some of the policy discussions that are taking place, which are going to be required in a more carbon-constrained economy. For refrigerant recycling, we've seen that has had a huge impact in a very short amount of time on an industry that is pretty big and is very important for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a point. For composting and AAD, I'm not sure where this is going. Yes, we have gotten some very large projects. It doesn't reach down to the smaller size projects very well. Partly because of bureaucracy and partly because of, mostly because of bureaucracy and transaction costs. And also realize that as more and more states, California has a statewide mandate for organics and commercial diversion that's phased in over time. Massachusetts has something similar. The city of New York has something similar. The city of Seattle has something similar, and you probably know others as well. Those mandates exclude the opportunity for carbon credit, for getting carbon offset credits from projects that develop in those jurisdictions, which is not bad or good. It points out that depending on whether people want to go command and control or through market-based policies, carbon credits are going to be viable or not. And then finally, I just discussed this, not likely eligible for hard materials recycling. And then the final slide, I guess the point I want to make here, one is that the EPA is coming out with rules. Unless they really get thrown off the track, they're going to cover all the states in one way or another. And the big point here, and we've been working primarily with offset credits for about 11 years now, offset credits are not the only possible way of monetizing the lower carbon value of project activities or products. So again, when we say carbon credits, we may mean the monetary value, but if it's interpreted as carbon offset credits, then that creates some confusion. There are other policy mechanisms and corporate mechanisms where projects that reduce emissions that might not be eligible technically for offset credits could still see encouragement or incentives, in a financial form. Let's see, the last section there shows a number of ways with the old, bag of policy tricks that can be, the ability to quantify is hugely important, particularly as these carbon constraints start to come down in the economy. And so having these methodologies in place is going to be helpful, and don't have time to elaborate, but you can imagine you can start to target grants based on actual environmental benefits and performance rather than just hoping they're going to work out. Tax breaks and credits can be given based on emission reductions quantification. And cities, communities, states, corporations that may be covered entities can kind of internalize it. So they're not really offset programs, except that they're essentially emissions reductions programs that run within an entity rather than being part of a formalized cap and trade style carbon offset program. And that one maybe I'm not sure I'm getting through on that one, but I think well, there's a number of other policy opportunities where carbon credit value or the emission reduction benefit is going to be important to somebody, major manufacturer, for example, or a city that has an emissions obligation. And we've seen examples of these already, and so I'm going to leave it there, but it's a bummer that plastic recycling isn't going to be eligible for carbon credits the way we speak of them today. But there are other things that are happening where a number of types of incentives, I think carbon is going to creep into all of these more traditional incentive programs or mechanisms. So I went a little bit over, but here we are.
Okay, Scott, we're now going to have some question and answer session for Scott. And again, thanks Scott for that very informative and a lot of information there. So hopefully all was able to digest it. Okay, we have some questions already. Okay, this one states, I thought financial additionality meant the project wouldn't have occurred without the revenue from selling offset credits. Is this not true?
It's sort of true. I think the way it's viewed by some programs or my federal programs is that it doesn't have to be live or die without offsets. There needs to be some perception that there is a marginal benefit that can occur, but you can be a profitable project, at least in the U.S. Now, if you go to the Clean Development Mechanism, which is the sort of the Kyoto or UN thing that's used for offset projects in developing nations, their financial test has been much stricter. And if you had a project that was going to make a reasonable, return on its investment, it was difficult to get through the financial test. In the U.S., there isn't, I guess profit's not as bad here as it is with the developing nations or with the World Bank, whoever manages it. But no, in the U.S., it doesn't matter if your project can make money. If the penetration of that project type is so low that clearly there are barriers out there. Even if you've got, how many people have seen a pro forma where you get a 25%? I certainly have seen a number of pro formas with a 25% return promise, and 1 out of 10 of those projects that you invest in actually have any kind of success at all. And so I think in the U.S., no, you can have a profitable project and still get carbon credits, but there are other parts of that test for additionality that is kind of override the financial test.
Okay, this next question asks, how much did the composting offsets sell for on average?
I can't talk about price for a couple of reasons. One is we run a fund, and so I have to be careful not to project, and 2, because a number of our contracts are confidential. But I can say that for some of our compost projects, largely because of some of the things I mentioned, connected with the communities, perhaps utilities in those communities, I would say that, okay, I can do it this way. Let's say maybe around now for an offset project eligible within the California program, basically the compliance market, you could probably get $9 or $10. And this, again, I'm not projecting. I'm just saying, market history has shown us roughly $8 to $10, let's say, for $10. Let's say $8 to $9, so I'm not going over. And for a ton, for a carbon credit. That's for a compliance market for a well-known project.
And that did show up on your graphs, Scott.
The composting stuff is in the voluntary market, so some people have not been able to sell their credits. Other people have been able to get prices approaching that of the California compliance market. So it really depends on the very specific relationship between the project developers, and the buyer.
Okay, next question asks, where can I find the plastics recycling protocols used abroad?
UNFCCC.org or net or com maybe. It's the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. They have the worst website in the world, but it's also full of stuff. Then you want to go to the Clean Development Mechanism link, CDM, or if you just type in UN CDM, it may get you, may get you to the same place. So the clean development mechanism is the overall offset program that's been working with the European trading system under the UN, and they are the big, this is where a lot of that IPCC work went into developing a number of methodologies for all sorts of project types. So that's where I caught that picture for the slide.
Okay, and Scott, if you want to bring up your contact information, perhaps that person can reach you directly.
Yeah, you can email me as well.
Yep. Okay, thank you. Next question is, what impact on organics credits will result from IPCC continually upgrading methane emissions and California ARB looking at methane short-term impact?
That's a really good question. The IPCC, well, I think what's more relevant is the California stuff. IPC will upgrade. Protocols get upgraded too. They go through versions, and so the newer versions are likely to look at what the latest, global warming potential for methane is. Actually, that would be at the program level in California. So that protocols are continually updated. Although once you get a protocol, usually you have a crediting period where you can use it without changing. So getting to the California point, California regulates its landfills more with regard to landfill gas collection much more stringently than is required by the EPA. California also has mandatory diversion of methane or of food residual organics from landfills being phased in over the next several years. So they've gone command and control on anything related to landfill methane emissions. Because of that, it's very unlikely at this point that we'll see a composting protocol show up on the official slate in California anytime soon. They've chosen command and control. And that's, frankly, that's what killed the landfill gas capture credit market in the U.S. when California decided to be more stringent with their rules. One of their rules is that, well, I need to go into the detail. Because they chose command and control and applied their laws, they're not allowing projects being done in other states to do something under laxer laws than theirs. And so we don't see landfill gas capture being part of the list of offset types for California, nor are we likely to see organic residuals recycling, at least in the shorter term. Even if they were pro both of those right now, it'd take 3 or 4 years to get a protocol in place.
Okay.
And approved.
All right, thank you. Next, it's more of a comment and then a question. It sounds like using credits is time-consuming and complicated for financing recycling and composting. Why should recyclers and composters bother with this process over other tools?
I would say that that's a good question, and then something here's what I say. There are several composting outfits that have benefited and have been highly incentivized by carbon credits. It's been worth their while. There are several others where it's just too difficult, and even if they don't have to carry the expense themselves, if we're working with them, we usually cover all these transaction costs and things and eat them if it goes south. It just is, the protocol should be simpler, frankly, but it's not. And finally is, if you're in a community where they're about to pass a diversion mandate, and that's going to force a lot of materials across your gate, well, that can be, I think there are backfires on that on a sort of a cost. Well, with regard to community cost, it could be higher, but that's a good thing. So if you're in a local community and there's an opportunity to get mandates in place, we've seen it happen. Now, what we've also seen happen is composting facilities working in sort of pilot status or partner status with their communities in very good relationships for years to develop the infrastructure that allows a mandate to be passed. It's very difficult to pass a mandate the next year you have to compost everything because we see even on the East Coast that has been a problem in recent years. So I'm not against mandates. I'm just clarifying that if there's a mandate in place, if that's the choice of the policymakers, that excludes the opportunity for offset credits.
Okay, this one references the bubble flow chart showing ODS recycling and changes in that market. Is there a bubble for ODS destruction? Is that the new player introduced into the market?
No, I think there's the top level predator. That's kind of that term. The top level recyclers have now incorporated destruction as a part of their activities. So the transformation has really occurred to some extent at the municipal collection level, but at the vigor with which the top level recyclers have been acquiring these older gases, and many of them, there are several of them that have developed their own destruction facilities. There's a facility in Philadelphia that has spent several $1 million on a huge refrigerator grinder that actually is essentially a vacuum grinder that sucks and then distills all of the gas out of the foam. And this is after the compressor has been removed. So the players, and I mean, from our perspective, it boils down to maybe less than a dozen top-level recycling entities who end up with most of this gas as it progresses through these pathways. I should have tried to make that clear earlier. And so the destruction is those guys who are doing it. And I think I hope that answers the question.
Well, again, if there's some follow-up there, they have your email. Do you envision some kind of valuation of carbon sequestration in the near future as opposed to offsets, cap and trade?
Again, that is another good question. I don't know. I can say that after working with offsets for 11 years, I really wish there were new policies that came along that open things up a bit. I think agriculture gets treated somewhat differently in the U.S., and so there may be some lobbies there where incentives for sequestration aren't necessarily carbon offset based, but I mean, you could still probably call it a carbon credit. I really don't know. I wish there were other incentive mechanisms in place right now. We're struggling even to get compost application protocols in place. There is one through the American Carbon Registry that essentially gives credits for applying compost to rangeland. It's focused mostly on western and mountain states. But there has been some movement. And then agricultural nitrogen use, there are a number of protocols related to that that I think California is even interested in. So that may, if they can distinguish between organic sources of nitrogen and inorganic sources of nitrogen, that may have some impact. And then the Chicago Climate Exchange a long time ago had basically a no-till credit for a while. So I'm not sure, again, I hope I answered the question, but I wish there was more effort in the agricultural sector.
Okay. All right, we have time for a couple more questions. If you're eligible for and generate LCFS, RINs, and/or REC credits for anaerobic digestion of food waste, can you also be eligible for and generate carbon offset credits for food waste? Is this considered double counting?
Well, I haven't been in that specific situation, so I could be wrong here, but I believe you could be eligible for both. There are different types of programs. One is not cap-based; it's quota-based. That would be the fuel standard. Whereas the greenhouse gas, the cap and trade program is a cap, and you have to protect the integrity of the cap. So people went back and forth with this a long time ago with producing electricity on livestock projects. If you're getting RECs for the energy, can you get carbon credits for the methane reductions? And so the same thing applies here. The methane reductions are what you're getting credit for if you're doing an anaerobic digester project. The petroleum, the avoided petroleum emissions is what you're getting credit for within a renewable fuel or low carbon fuel standard. So they're really kind of separate benefits. They're not bundled together, and so it isn't really double counting. That's my understanding of it.
Okay, this will be the last question. Do you offer the refrigerant training /removal/royalty program in states outside of Pennsylvania? How many appliances per year collected would make it worth doing?
I can't. Well, we'd be open to talking to people what they're doing in their states. There are a number of, I mean, through this recycling network, it doesn't have to be someone out of the ECC office or specifically an ECC program. We've looked at setting up similar programs in other states through a gas supplier or an HVAC maintenance firm. So I'd be interested in communicating with whoever had the question, because we're trying to understand the needs. We really like the program. It's, like I said, it's not a huge moneymaker, but it feels like it's having impact, despite the money, all the money. The big industrial ODS stuff is big money and big impact, but I think these municipal programs, exchange programs, or the recovery program, can still have a pretty good impact on people's behavior without having to be a huge big deal money-wise. So anyway, long answer, but yeah, if you want to give me an email, I can talk to Derek Six, our CEO, who manages the program, and maybe give you a call.
Okay. All right, we're just about out of time, so we're going to close the webinar. Again, this webinar, like all the webinars in this series, has been recorded and will be made available via YouTube links on both the National Recycling Coalition and Recycling Market Center websites. Thank you for all those who logged on for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed it. And thank you again, Scott, for taking the time out to make the presentation. And we'll hope you join us for next month's webinar. And please visit our websites to get any schedule updates. Again, thanks for logging on, and have a great day.
Thanks, Wayne. Bye-bye.